Nobody noticed him. That was the point. At the Whitmore Grand Hotel's 32nd floor ballroom, where crystal chandeliers threw gold light across silk tablecloths and men in suits worth more than most people's monthly rent shook hands over promises they'd already decided to break, the man with the mop was simply part of the scenery. Invisible by design, he moved along the far wall with slow, practiced efficiency. Eyes down, jaw loose, the posture of someone who had spent a long time learning how not to be seen. Then a small girl in a white dress burst through a side door and ran straight toward him, her face twisted with something raw and real. She grabbed his sleeve with both hands. Her eyes were everything. The room was not honest, terrified, immediate. "They're hurting my mom," she said. In the 3 seconds that followed, something changed in the man holding the mop. The shoulders squared. The eyes went flat and precise. And the person who had been invisible simply ceased to exist. Nathaniel Brooks was 35 years old, and he had learned to carry his past the way some men carry old injuries quietly, without complaint, adjusting his gait so that no one could tell anything had ever gone wrong. He worked the 6-to-2 shift at the Whitmore Grand, one of the city's most prestigious event spaces, pushing a cart through corridors that cost more per square foot than the apartment he shared with his daughter. His official title was Facility Maintenance Associate, which was the hotel's way of saying he cleaned things that wealthy people didn't want to think about. He was good at his job. He was thorough, punctual, and almost completely silent, which the event managers appreciated. He never lingered near guests. He never made eye contact unless spoken to. He was, in the language of 5-star hospitality, unobtrusive. Emily Brooks was 6 years old and kept a small collection of smooth river stones on her windowsill that she had personally approved for their color and shape. She attended first grade at Eastwick Elementary, where she was known by her teacher as both exceptionally empathetic and impossible to fool. She cried once at a movie, then spent the rest of the week asking her father detailed questions about why people did unkind things to each other. Nathaniel had no answer she found satisfying, so she decided the question was still open. She stayed with Mrs. Patton next door on nights when her father worked the late event shifts, and she always left a light on in the kitchen in case he came home tired. Charlotte Sinclair was 41 years old and had not taken a full day off in 4 years. She ran Sinclair Capital Management with a precision that her board admired, her rivals feared, and her ex-husband had once described, during arbitration, as exhausting. She wore authority the way other women wore jewelry deliberately, as a form of communication. In the weeks leading up to the Whitmore event, she had been finalizing the most significant acquisition of her career, a deal that would consolidate 3 mid-sized logistics firms under the Sinclair umbrella and effectively double the company's operational reach. She had done everything right. The numbers were sound, the legal framework was airtight, and the signature ceremony had been booked for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening. Ava Sinclair was 7 years old and had inherited her mother's attention to detail and her father's talent for reading a room. She sat quietly at the children's table near the ballroom's east wall that evening, working through the complimentary dessert course with methodical focus, and watched the adults around her with the particular alertness of a child who has spent a significant portion of her life in rooms where she was not supposed to notice things. She noticed things. She noticed when her mother's smile went tight at the corners. She noticed when the 3 men in dark suits stopped laughing and started speaking in low, deliberate tones that were different from normal conversation. And she noticed when one of them put a hand on her mother's elbow in a way that did not look like politeness. Nathaniel had first encountered Charlotte Sinclair 6 days earlier, when she arrived for a pre-event walkthrough and found him replacing a ceiling tile in the east corridor. She had looked at him the way certain people look at maintenance workers, not with hostility, exactly, but with a specific variety of non-recognition, as if his presence in that space required a brief internal recalibration of what the space was for. She had turned to the events coordinator and said, quietly, but not quietly enough, that she had assumed this sort of thing would be handled before her guests arrived. Nathaniel had kept his eyes on the ceiling tile. He had finished the job and moved on. He had not thought much about it afterward. People said things like that. It was a fact of the work. The event began at 6:30. By 7, the champagne was circulating. The string quartet had shifted from Vivaldi to something more ambient, and the room had reached that particular temperature of organized elegance, where everyone looks exactly as they intended to look. Nathaniel worked the perimeter, emptying small bins and wiping down service stations with the invisible efficiency that the job required. He was not supposed to be in the main hall during the reception, but the housekeeping supervisor had called in sick and the schedule had been reshuffled, which meant Nathaniel was covering both the service corridor and the lower ballroom perimeter. He had done it before. He knew the traffic patterns. It was during his second pass along the north wall that he caught the exchange. He was perhaps 15 feet from the cluster of 4 people near the window alcove Charlotte, flanked by her CFO and 2 men. Nathaniel did not recognize from the pre-event materials he'd glanced at while restocking the supply cart that morning. The 2 strangers were not loud. They were, in fact, conspicuously quiet, which was its own kind of signal. Nathaniel had spent years learning to read the difference between a conversation that was merely private and one that was being controlled. This was the second kind. He did not stop moving. Stopping would have made him visible. He pushed the cart at a steady pace and let the sounds travel naturally into his peripheral awareness. Fragments of the exchange reached him without effort. Something about a vote that wasn't going the way certain parties had anticipated. Something about fiduciary exposure. Something about what became possible when controlling interests aligned in unexpected ways. None of it was subtle to someone who had learned to parse the language of pressure. The men were not discussing business. They were delivering a message. Charlotte's voice, when it came, was measured in the way that voices become when the person speaking is working hard to keep the register level. She said that she was not interested in revisiting terms that had been agreed upon, and that she would recommend they enjoy the evening. One of the men smiled at that. The smile was the most informative part of the entire exchange. Nathaniel continued to the end of the wall and turned the corner. He set the cart against the service door and stood still for a moment. His breathing was even. His mind was doing what it had been trained to do. Cataloging, sequencing, assigning probability. The 2 men were not investors in any conventional sense. Their body language was too controlled, too practiced. The way they had positioned themselves relative to Charlotte, one on each side, close enough to suggest containment, was not accidental. Nathaniel had seen that geometry before in circumstances that had nothing to do with business. He checked his watch. It was 7:22. He noted the location of the VIP suite at the end of the east corridor. He noted that the security desk had a 2-person team tonight instead of the usual 3. He did not consciously decide to pay attention. He simply did not stop. At the children's table, Ava Sinclair had set down her spoon. Her eyes were moving between the adults near the window alcove and the door at the far end of the room. She was 7 years old. She was very good at reading rooms. At 7:49, Charlotte Sinclair was escorted from the main ballroom. Nathaniel saw it happen from the service corridor window, a narrow rectangle of glass that looked directly across the hall's secondary entrance. There was nothing violent about it. That was the design. One of the men had a hand at the small of her back, and the other had shifted to her left side, and the group was moving at a pace that looked, from a distance, like 3 colleagues stepping away for a quiet word. The events coordinator at the far end of the room did not register it as unusual. The CFO had been cornered near the bar by 2 other men whom Nathaniel now recognized, from their positioning, as part of the same coordinated effort. Charlotte was being separated from her allies deliberately, 1 thread at a time. Nathaniel had already set down the cart. He was moving toward the service corridor door when he heard the sound behind him, small, fast footsteps on marble tile, the high percussion of dress shoes belonging to someone too young and too urgent to care about noise. He turned. Ava Sinclair had pushed through the side door and was crossing the corridor at a run, her white dress catching the light, her face carrying an expression that had no place in a room full of canapés and champagne. She stopped in front of him, breathing hard, and looked up. For a brief moment, she seemed to be conducting a rapid internal assessment of whether he was the right person to tell. Whatever she concluded quickly. "They're hurting my mom," she said. "The men in the dark suits. They took her through that door, and I heard her voice go different, and I know something is wrong." Nathaniel crouched down to her level. He looked at her directly. "Which door?" Ava pointed without hesitation. "East corridor, end of the hall, the door marked private event that led to the VIP suite." "How many men?" he said. "3, she said. "But 1 stayed near the bar, so 2 went with her." Nathaniel stood. Something in his face had reorganized itself in a way that was hard to describe and easy to feel. The diffidence was gone. The careful vacancy that he wore like a service uniform had simply stepped aside, revealing something underneath that was calm and geometrically precise. He put a hand briefly on Ava's shoulder. "Stay here," he said. "Don't go back into the main room. Stay by this door. Are you going to help her?" "Yes," he said. It was not a reassurance. It was a statement of operational fact. He moved down the east corridor at a pace that was not quite a run but covered ground very quickly. He passed the second security camera at 7:51, which the footage would confirm later. He paused for 2 seconds outside the VIP suite door, his hand resting flat against the wood panel, reading vibration, reading sound. He heard 3 distinct patterns of movement inside the room, 2 standing, 1 seated. He heard Charlotte's voice clipped, controlled, refusing something. He heard one of the men say, with the flat patience of someone who has done this before, that she should reconsider her position while she still had a comfortable position to reconsider. Nathaniel opened the door and walked in. The VIP suite was a room designed to make people feel that power was elegant and permanent. Dark wood paneling, a long conference table, 2 narrow windows looking out over the city's lit skyline. Charlotte was seated at the near end of the table, her posture rigorously upright, her hands flat on the surface in front of her. The 2 men stood on opposite sides of the room, which told Nathaniel they had positioned themselves deliberately, one near the door, one near the windows, both angles covered. A third was standing directly behind Charlotte's chair, leaning forward slightly, which was meant to communicate dominance and proximity simultaneously. None of them had time to react in any coordinated way. What Nathaniel did in the next 40 seconds was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no announcement, no escalation, no exchange of warnings. He had learned, in context that most people in that building could not have imagined, that violence permitted to develop was violence that became more dangerous and less contained. The first principle was always the same. Address the immediate threat while the situation was still legible. The man near the door came toward him first, which was a miscalculation. Nathaniel used the man's own forward momentum against him, redirecting the advance with a controlled arm lock that dropped the man to his knees and put him face down on the floor in under 3 seconds, his right arm at an angle that communicated very clearly that standing up would be inadvisable. The second man, the one at the window, had moved to a different position in the time it took, which was instinct rather than training. Nathaniel could read the difference. He was bigger, and he came in harder, and Nathaniel absorbed the initial impact and used the wall to finish it, a sequence of movements so compressed and economical that Charlotte, watching from the table, later described it as happening faster than her ability to process what she was seeing. The man sat down hard against the baseboard and did not get up. The third man, the one who had been standing behind Charlotte's chair, made the choice that many people make when they realize the situation has changed faster than their contingency plans. He took a step back, then another, then stopped because there was nowhere useful to go. Nathaniel looked at him for a moment. "Sit down," he said. The tone was conversational. The third man sat down. Charlotte had not moved from her chair. Her hands were still flat on the table, but the knuckles had gone white and then slowly returned to their normal color as she breathed. She was looking at Nathaniel with an expression that contained several things she had not yet had time to sort into order. "Is anyone else coming?" Nathaniel asked her. She found her voice. "A fourth, near the bar. He was managing Marcus." "Your CFO?" "Yes." Nathaniel pulled out his phone and made a call. 20 seconds later, the hotel's head of security, who had received a brief, precise set of instructions, was moving toward the main ballroom. Nathaniel had the direct number because he had personally replaced the security desk's cable routing 3 weeks ago and had introduced himself. Small facts. They compounded. Outside in the east corridor, Ava Sinclair was standing exactly where she had been told to stand. She had not moved. When the door opened and her mother walked out, supported at the elbow by the maintenance worker in the gray uniform, Ava crossed the distance between them without a word and pressed her face into her mother's side with a force that communicated everything a 7-year-old could not yet articulate. Charlotte wrapped both arms around her daughter and held on. Nathaniel stood 2 steps back and said nothing. The security team arrived 40 seconds later. By then, the situation was already over. The aftermath of the event spread through the Whitmore Grand staff channels within the hour. Security had detained 3 men in the VIP suite and a 4th in the main ballroom, all of whom were later identified as operatives working on behalf of a dissident shareholder group that had been quietly accumulating proxy votes in the weeks before the ceremony. The hotel's night manager, reviewing footage from the East Corridor camera, called the head of security twice before either of them could fully articulate what they were watching. A man in a gray maintenance uniform had walked through a door and neutralized a room containing 3 adult men. Men who, subsequent background checks would reveal, had professional histories that did not begin or end with corporate maneuvering in under a minute, with no injuries beyond those that were strictly necessary and no escalation beyond the minimum required. Charlotte Sinclair sat in the hotel manager's office with a glass of water she had not touched and watched the footage on a laptop that the security director had set up for her without speaking. She watched it 3 times. Each time she arrived at the moment when Nathaniel Brooks opened the door to the VIP suite, she found herself focusing not on what happened next but on the 2 seconds before the way he had paused, hand on the door panel, reading something that was not visible on camera, making calculations she still could not reverse engineer. She recognized competence when she saw it. She had built her career on being able to identify it across a wide range of domains. What she was watching was competence of a variety she had not previously needed to account for. The guests in the main ballroom had not been fully aware of the scope of what had happened. There had been some confusion near the bar, some raised voices, a brief commotion that the events staff had managed efficiently. The signing ceremony was postponed, which was announced as a scheduling adjustment, and most attendees had filed out by 9:30. The string quartet had played through it all. When Nathaniel came to collect his cart from the East Corridor, Charlotte was waiting for him. Ava was with her, standing close to her mother's side, holding her hand. She watched Nathaniel approach with an expression of complete and unself-conscious trust, the way children look at people who have demonstrated, through action rather than assertion, that they are safe. Charlotte opened her mouth and found that the sentence she had prepared something appropriately formal, something that preserved the correct professional distance while acknowledging an extraordinary situation, was not the sentence that came out. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For the other week." In the corridor, Nathaniel stopped. He looked at her. The careful neutrality he wore at work was still there, but it sat differently on him now, and they both knew it. "You don't," he said. "People say things." "I know what people say," Charlotte said. "I said it." "That's different." Ava looked up at her mother, then at Nathaniel, then back at her mother. She appeared to be conducting the same kind of rapid assessment she had applied in the corridor earlier that evening. She had apparently reached a satisfactory conclusion, because she let go of her mother's hand, walked forward 2 steps, and hugged Nathaniel's leg. He looked down at her. His expression changed in a way that only happened for Nathaniel Brooks. Around children, something in the careful geometry of his face softened and became briefly, completely unguarded. He put a hand on the top of Ava's head. Charlotte watched this and said nothing. She was doing the rapid, involuntary recalibration that happens when a person you have filed incorrectly turns out to require an entirely different category. Charlotte Sinclair spent the following 3 days doing what she did with any problem that required resolution. She gathered information. She contacted her head of HR, who contacted the hotel's staffing agency, who provided a standard employment summary that told her almost nothing. She contacted a private investigation firm she had used for corporate due diligence, provided them with a name and a face, and asked them to find out who Nathaniel Brooks actually was. What they found took less than 48 hours to compile and considerably longer to fully process. Nathaniel James Brooks had enlisted in the Army at age 18 and had separated from service at age 30, a 12-year career that included 3 deployments and a classified operational record that the investigator summarized, with professional discretion, as extensive. He had served in a Special Forces unit, whose specific designation the investigator could not confirm, but whose operational theater and timeline aligned with a set of missions that had been referenced, obliquely, in 3 separate congressional oversight summaries in the last decade. He had received commendations that were a matter of public record, and others that were not. His separation from service had been driven by 2 concurrent factors: a knee injury sustained during a training exercise in his final year, and the death of his wife, Sarah, from a cardiac event 10 weeks after their daughter was born. She was 28 years old. Emily had been 6 weeks old when her mother died. Charlotte read this part twice. The investigator's summary noted that Brooks had spent 2 years after his medical separation working private security contracts, then had stopped. There was no explanation in the available records for why he had stopped. But the timeline placed the cessation of that work at approximately the point when Emily was old enough to be aware of her surroundings and to ask questions about where her father went. Charlotte was not a person who drew sentimental conclusions from circumstantial evidence. She drew this one anyway, because it was the most logical reading of the facts. He had taken the maintenance job at the Whitmore Grand 14 months ago. His performance reviews were uniformly excellent. He had been commended twice for handling minor crises, a guest medical situation, a fire system malfunction, with what his supervisor described as unusual calm and efficiency. The supervisor had noted, in a handwritten addendum to one review, that Brooks seemed to understand systems better than anyone he had worked with. He had not elaborated on what he meant. He did not need to. There was one additional detail in the investigator's report that Charlotte returned to several times over the following days. 12 years ago, during a corporate security review commissioned by Sinclair Capital's predecessor firm before her father had handed her the reins, a private contractor had been brought in to assess the company's physical security infrastructure at its then headquarters in the downtown district. The contractor had been young, thorough, and had filed a report that her father had described as the most comprehensive assessment he had ever received. The contractor's name had been noted in the archived filing as N. Brooks. Charlotte sat with this information in the quiet of her office on a Friday morning and felt the specific discomfort of someone who has been given an account of events that she had not been present for, events that had, nonetheless, shaped the circumstances of her current life in ways she was only now beginning to trace. She was not a person who believed in coincidence as a category. She believed in systems. She believed in the invisible geometry of cause and effect. And she believed, after 3 days of looking carefully at Nathaniel Brooks, that she had been seeing him wrong from the very first moment. The security footage from the Whitmore Grand was not supposed to leave the hotel's internal system. It left the hotel's internal system on the 4th day after the event, transmitted through a channel that the IT team would later trace to an admin-level credential that had been accessed remotely. By that evening, it was circulating among the mid-level staff of 4 separate firms that held seats on Sinclair Capital's advisory board. By the following morning, it had been seen by people at a level considerably above mid-level. Charlotte had anticipated this. She had, in fact, counted on it. What the footage showed was unambiguous. 3 men, identified by name in the investigation, had escorted Charlotte Sinclair into a private room under what subsequent legal filings described as coercive circumstances, had made explicit demands relating to the upcoming shareholder vote, and had been removed from the situation by a hotel maintenance worker before any formal security response had arrived. The 3 men were employees of a holding entity with indirect ties to a shareholder coalition that had been building its position in Sinclair Capital for the better part of 18 months. The 4th man, the one at the bar, had been recorded in a separate segment making phone calls that the investigators had subsequently obtained warrants to review. The calls were not ambiguous either. Charlotte convened a special session of the board 12 days after the event. She requested that legal counsel be present, which was unusual, and she requested that it be in person rather than remote, which was more unusual still. She arrived 7 minutes early, which was her standard. She set a tablet in front of her place at the table and did not explain what was on it until every board member was seated and the room was secured. She presented the findings from the investigation methodically, without editorializing, in the way that she had always been most effective, letting the weight of documented fact accumulate until the conclusion became impossible to dispute. The 3 men and their associates had been engaged in a coordinated campaign to manufacture conditions for a hostile takeover of the company by engineering a vote of no confidence, which required Charlotte's public discrediting or her removal from the room at a critical moment. They had been 12 days and 1 maintenance worker away from succeeding. When she reached the end of the presentation, she paused for a moment. Then she turned the tablet to face the room and played 40 seconds of footage from the East Corridor camera. "The person you're watching," she said, "is not a corporate security contractor. He is not a former executive brought in for the event. He is the man who replaces ceiling tiles in the East Corridor on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. His name is Nathaniel Brooks, and the reason we are all still sitting in this room instead of negotiating terms with people who manufactured a crisis is because a 7-year-old girl found him mopping a floor." The room was quiet for a long moment. The shareholder coalition dissolved over the following weeks, under the combined pressure of 3 active investigations, 2 civil suits, and the particular social cost of having your attempted corporate coup documented on video and circulated to every person whose opinion you were counting on. Charlotte lent her counsel to the process, but did not drive it. She had other things on her mind. The days that followed had a different quality than Charlotte Sinclair was accustomed to. She had spent so much of the preceding years moving at operational velocity, decision to decision, quarter to quarter, and crisis to resolution, that the slower rhythm of the weeks after the Whitmore event felt almost disorienting, the way a fast river feels when it opens unexpectedly into still water. She took Ava to school herself on 3 consecutive mornings, which had not happened since the previous September. On the 3rd morning, Ava talked the entire drive about a girl in her class who had brought in a collection of smooth stones and was able to identify each of them by type. Charlotte listened in a way she had not been listening, not scheduling the next thing behind her eyes, not parsing for information that required action, but simply being in the car with her daughter's voice. Ava noticed. Children always noticed. She reached over from the back seat at a red light and put her small hand over her mother's hand on the gear shift, and said nothing, because she was 7, and she understood that some things did not require annotation. Charlotte found Nathaniel at the hotel on a Wednesday morning. He was in the service corridor near the kitchen, checking a pressure reading on a water line. He looked up when she appeared, registered her presence without visible surprise, and set the gauge down on the cart. He waited. She asked him how he was. She asked how Emily was. She learned, in the conversation that followed unhurried, without the corporate architecture that usually framed her interactions, that Emily collected riverstones by shape and color, that she was in 1st grade, that she had strong views about the specific geometry of acceptable breakfast foods. Charlotte listened to all of this and recognized, with the precise internal register of someone who is used to identifying value when she sees it, that this was not a man performing modesty. This was a man who had made a series of very deliberate choices about what his life was going to look like and was living exactly inside those choices. Ava had asked, the night before, if the nice man from the hotel had a daughter. Charlotte had said yes. Ava had considered this. Then she had asked if the daughter liked stones. Charlotte did not yet know the answer to that question, but she suspected it was yes. There were 2 more conversations over the following 2 weeks. Neither long, both in the hotel corridor or the lobby, both navigated with the careful mutual courtesy of 2 people who are aware of a changed relationship without yet having any shared language for what that change consists of. Nathaniel was not guarded. Exactly, he was measured. He spoke about Emily in a way that made it evident that his daughter was the organizing principle around which all other decisions had arranged themselves. Charlotte found this less foreign than she might have expected, and the recognition of that familiarity was its own quiet shift in the geography of how she understood herself. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Charlotte's assistant placed a formal meeting request on Nathaniel's calendar, a courtesy that would have been comedic if it weren't a genuine expression of how seriously Charlotte was now approaching this particular interaction. Nathaniel showed up at the hotel's executive conference room at 10 in the morning in the same gray uniform he always wore, which Charlotte had specifically asked him not to change for the meeting, a request whose precise reasoning she had not examined, but which felt important. She offered him the position of Director of Security Strategy, a newly created role that reported directly to her office and came with a salary she articulated clearly and without the usual executive padding. The role involved assessing and redesigning the company's physical and operational security frameworks, consulting on risk protocols, and building an internal capability that Sinclair Capital had never actually had because its previous leadership had assumed that external contractors covered that need. She watched him listen to all of this. She watched him look at the window for a moment, then back at her. No, he said. Charlotte had anticipated several responses. She had not specifically anticipated no. She took a breath. I'd like to understand your reasoning, Emily, he said. She's 6. I spent 12 years inside situations where the level of risk I was carrying was not something I could fully account for. I chose to stop. I chose this. He gestured briefly at the uniform, at the cart visible through the conference room glass. Not as a punishment. As a decision. She's going to grow up knowing where her father is every night. Charlotte sat with this for a moment. She did not push back, because pushing back against a person's articulated, considered values was not something she was willing to do, which was its own quiet marker of how much had changed in her in 3 weeks. I understand that, she said. And I'm not asking you to go back to what you were doing before. I'm asking you to consult. Here, inside an office building with standard working hours and a security team, you would actually design. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. You'd have full veto power on the role parameters, she said. If anything changes in a direction you're not comfortable with, you walk. Same day, no consequences. And Emily? School hours. You set your schedule around hers. He said nothing for a moment. He was, Charlotte had learned, a person who did not fill silences with noise. She waited. He stood up and went to the window. The city was visible below, organized and dense, and full of the kind of invisible machinery that only certain people ever learned to read. His daughter was in school right now, probably at her desk near the window, probably with a stone in her pocket that she had approved that morning for its color and its weight. He turned back to Charlotte. I need to think about it, he said. I need to talk to someone. Charlotte nodded. She already suspected who. The conversation happened at the kitchen table that evening. Emily was working through her spelling homework with the focused intensity she brought to tasks that she had decided were worth doing correctly, and Nathaniel was washing dishes and talking to her the way he always talked to her directly, without softening the information into shapes he thought were easier for her to hold. He told her about the job. He told her what it was and what it wasn't. He told her that he had said he needed to think about it because thinking about it first was how you made decisions that you didn't regret later. Emily listened to all of this without looking up from her worksheet, her pencil moving steadily. When he finished, she put the pencil down and looked at him. You always help people, she said. You helped that lady's little girl. You helped the man who fell in the lobby that one time. You helped Mrs. Patton when her furnace broke. She looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has not yet learned the social convention of softening observation. Why would you stop? Nathaniel stood at the sink and looked at his daughter for a long moment. She looked back at him, waiting. Patient in the way that children are patient when they are completely confident in what they are saying. He dried his hands on the dish towel. You'd be okay with it? He said. Emily picked up her pencil. I'd be more okay with it than you not doing it, she said, which was, for a 6-year-old, a remarkably complete sentence. Nathaniel called Charlotte the following morning. He accepted the position with 3 stated conditions, articulated with the same economy he brought to everything: standard hours, no field work, and a clause that allowed him to exit without notice if the nature of the role changed in ways he had not agreed to. Charlotte accepted all 3 without negotiation, which was the closest she had come in years to making a professional decision based entirely on what she believed was right rather than what she calculated was advantageous. She was not certain whether those 2 things were, in this case, different. The first day Nathaniel came into the Sinclair Capital offices, he wore his own clothes, a plain gray shirt, dark pants, nothing that signified anything to anyone who didn't already know the story. He walked through the lobby the way he walked through every room he entered, reading the geometry, cataloging the exits, noting the camera positions and the 2 places where the sightlines failed. He sat down at the desk in the small office Charlotte had prepared and spent the morning writing notes in his characteristic, compressed-style short sentences, numbered sequences, no decoration that would eventually become the first comprehensive security framework the company had ever had. At 3:15, he left to pick up Emily from school. This was not in any document. It was simply a fact of how the day was organized, and everyone in the office had been briefed on it. And no one said anything about it because Charlotte had made clear, in her brief and unambiguous way, that this was how it was going to be. Ava was not at school that day. She had a dentist appointment that had run long, but the following week, on a Tuesday, she and Emily met for the first time in the lobby of the Sinclair building, when Charlotte brought her in after pickup. The 2 girls studied each other for a moment with the frank, calibrating attention of children who have not yet learned to pretend indifference. Then Emily reached into her jacket pocket and produced a smooth, pale gray stone that she had selected that morning and held it out. Ava took it, turned it over in her hands, and said it was a good one. Emily agreed that it was. They sat down together on the lobby bench and began to conduct what appeared to be a detailed audit of Ava's current stone knowledge, and Charlotte stood across the lobby and watched them and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Nathaniel stood a few steps behind her. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said, and they both knew it. This was not an ending, and it was not a declaration, and it was not the beginning of something that had been scripted in advance. It was simply what it was. Two people who had come into each other's lives at speed, through circumstances neither of them had chosen, and were now standing in the quiet aftermath, looking at their daughters, learning how to be in the same room without the urgency that had first put them there. That was enough for now. The rest of it was still being written.